If Iraq does not reverse its course peacefully, then other necessary measures, including the use of force, should be authorized.
On the 29th of November 1990, the United Nations Security Council approves Resolution 678, giving the Iraqi government until the 15th of January 1991 to make a complete and unconditional withdrawal from Kuwait, after which time coalition forces are authorized to use all necessary means to drive the Iraqis out.
The intransigence of the Iraqi regime is the real reason that is pushing the region at this point to a conflagration that we do not want to see, but it's being imposed upon us.
The government has today decided to deploy an extra brigade, a divisional headquarters, and supporting arms. They will join 7 Armoured Brigade in Saudi Arabia to form the 1st Armoured Division.
I was never happy with only a brigade out there. I know you'll say, well, no commander's ever happy with the amount of troops he's got, but in this case, there were very good reasons why we needed a larger formation than a brigade. Because once I got a division there, then I knew that that would be on standalone operations, it would be given a concept of operations, it would be given a broad directive, and how it achieved it would be up to the division, quite different to the state of affairs that had been a brigade.
Meanwhile, with their initial desert training program completed, 7th Armoured Brigade Group exercise in support of the US Marines defending the Saudi border with Kuwait.
We were working all the time with the Marsent planning team, and we were building berms and Iraqi-type defensive positions and practicing how we could get through these very unpleasant obstacles. And so the offensive planning was well underway. But at this stage, of course, it was 7th Brigade working with Marsent with the possibility of going due north straight into Kuwait.
During December, with leading elements of the 1st Armoured Division now arriving in Al Jubail, General de la Billière continues to press for the division to be deployed not with the US Marines, but with the US Army's 7th Corps over to the west.
We have to remember that our division was, for the British, a very substantial contribution. And I felt that both, not only the military at home, but the public at home would wish to see that division employed in a role that was of sufficient importance to justify the sacrifices we'd made to get it out there.
The planning to ensure that the war, when it came, would be both swift and decisive centers upon a bold left-flanking thrust by the US 7th and part of the 18th Corps deep into Iraq, striking at the Republican Guard formations upon which Saddam Hussein is heavily dependent. These are his best-trained and best-equipped forces, positioned to act as a mobile tactical reserve and intended to counter any attempted breakthrough by coalition forces attacking directly into Kuwait from Saudi Arabia, the route which Saddam clearly expected the main thrust of any coalition offensive to take, and for which Marsent's own planners are preparing, as a significant but diversionary operation to mask the coalition's left-flanking attack. Prior to General de la Billière taking up his command in the Gulf, Colonel Tim Sullivan had joined a 4-service planning team, including the Royal Marines, at Joint Headquarters High Wycombe.
Really the aim of the team was to brief the Joint Commander so that when he went out to Saudi Arabia, he had the background knowledge to be able to discuss things with General Schwarzkopf. We looked at several things. We looked at how we would eject the Iraqis out of Kuwait and whether, for example, we would do a frontal attack and push them straight out of Kuwait, or whether we would do some form of left-flanking attack. And in order to do these studies, we culled what information we could about the American forces that was freely available. We used what intelligence information that we had, much of which was from American sources, and then came up with a plan. And in that instance, we did come up with a plan, which was a left-flanking plan, which matched to a remarkable extent the plan that I discovered when I went out to the Gulf a week or so later.
With planning underway for possible offensive operations, the role of the British 1st Armoured Division was initially assumed by the American planners to be like that of 7 Brigade in the defensive phase, namely supporting the US Marines in the eastern coastal area where Kuwait borders directly with Saudi Arabia.
We ultimately decided, or I ultimately decided, what they should do, and I was ultimately responsible for what they should do, what they were going to do. But if they were going to fight under somebody else's command, as indeed the division was, then I was going to lose control of them when the fighting started, and still be responsible if there was a balls up and we had a lot of unnecessary casualties or they were misemployed. So it was my intention at a very early stage to see that I set up procedures that enabled me to exercise this responsibility in such a way that I would not interfere once the battle had started, because I would have been satisfied that what the British troops was employed on was a task that was within their capabilities and which was within the overall political directions that I'd received from the UK.
Resubordination was an issue because originally when we went out there we only had 1 brigade, and a brigade cannot operate tactically on its own and therefore needs to be within a division. And I think for all the right reasons it was decided that that brigade should be with the Marines. However, when it was decided that we would reinforce and bring out a complete division, the factors changed. And there were several factors that made us decide that we ought to resubordinate from the Marines to our centre and put them into 7 Corps. The first one is that the 1st UK Division was a major part of the British Army, and that therefore it ought to be on the main effort, and the British public would expect that to be the case. Secondly, the terrain in 7 Corps sector on the main effort was better suited to manoeuvre warfare for which we had trained.
Norman Swartzworth and I both fought in wars before. We'd both seen unnecessary casualties, and we were both determined that there would not be unnecessary casualties in this war. And that played a major part in the overall planning and strategy and conduct of operations, particularly in the ground war.
While these highly secret and sensitive issues occupy the minds of the senior commanders and the planning staff, Major General Rupert Smith, commanding the 1st Armoured Division, faces the more immediate problems arising from his brief reconnaissance visit to Saudi in early November.
At the end of the reconnaissance, I felt I had enough information to write a directive to my commanders, and in it I stated our aim as a division is to be in Saudi Arabia and ready to conduct operations under the tactical control of our United States ally by the 31st of January 1991. Now, the nature of operations could only be decided in the broadest of terms. I did not know at the time whether I was to be commanded by a United States Army Corps commander or a Marine Corps commander. What was clear was that the operations would be offensive. Initially, our purpose was to demonstrate an offensive capability as part of the diplomatic campaign. But if that failed, as indeed it did, then we would have to actually go and fight the Iraqis for Kuwait. The force ratios were such that we were outnumbered. Therefore, we would have to concentrate on a few axes and go in deep and fast to destroy the centre of gravity of the Iraqis' defence. I did not know at that stage where I was going to do this, or, as I've said, under whose command I would be in doing it, nor did I know the theatre plan as a whole. Those all were made clear to me at the end of December.
The 1st Armoured Division is to comprise 7th Armoured Brigade, already in theatre, 4th Armoured Brigade, a regiment of medium recce, an artillery group, and regiments of Armoured Engineers and Army Air Corps. With their supporting units, the number of British troops now to be deployed in the Gulf is doubled to around 35,000, over half the size of the British Army of the Rhine at this time. 4th Armoured Brigade is considerably changed from its peacetime grouping and comprises 14th 20th King's Hussars, 1st Battalion the Royal Scots and 3rd Battalion the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, together with 2nd Field Regiment Royal Artillery and 2-3 Engineer Regiment. As the 4th Armoured Brigade comes together in its new and as yet unfamiliar grouping to prepare for rapid departure to the Gulf, the artillery group faces its own equally demanding task of integrating diverse units and assimilating new equipments.
The grouping of the Divisional Artillery Group was unusual because besides the gunner regiments, there was both the Medium Recce Regiment and the Aviation Regiment. The purpose in doing that was twofold. Firstly, to ensure that there were as few points of command as possible for the GOC, to ensure that the interests of those regiments were being dealt with by an appropriate level commander, a one-star commander at brigade level. And secondly, it reflected the GOC's philosophy for the battle that he wished to fight, which was to fight simultaneously both the battle in depth and the contact battle. The depth battle to engage the targets that might interfere with the contact battle. There was a problem of target acquisition, and one of the means of overcoming that was to use the Medium Recce Regiment, besides all their normal medium reconnaissance roles, as target acquisition in depth. The integration of reinforcements in the artillery group was a major task. It wasn't that much of a problem from the training point of view because the reinforcements were all regular. The problem was the scale. Many of the gunner regiments doubled in size.
In addition to the necessity in all units of the artillery group to assimilate this huge increase in numbers, a major new equipment, the multiple launch rocket system, has to be hurriedly brought into service by 3-9 Heavy Regiment.
When we first got wind of our involvement on Operation Granby, we only had 5 launchers in the regiment. We were told that we were due to go with 12 at UE, at Unit Establishment, and we would take an additional 1, which was going to be Repair Pool, and that would be held in unit lines, plus a further 3 War Maintenance Reserve. So we were looking at a total of 16, and we only had 5 when we were warned off. So the system was rattled in order to produce more, and they were literally rolling straight off the factory production line, Aerospatiale in France, being pushed through the Ord system very rapidly. The few mods required to create the UK variant were carried out in record time, and then they were appearing here. A couple were delivered direct to us at the ranges at Hona, and some actually did not appear until we were out in the Gulf.
During the latter part of December, the build-up of the 1st Armoured Division is fully underway as personnel and equipment arrive in Al Jubail.
When we arrived in Jubail, in Saudi Arabia, that we arrived into the FMA, who by then had already had the experience of mounting 7th Armoured Brigade from its port of disembarkation out into the desert. And so by then there was considerable experience, and the reception arrangements from the point of view of the individuals were very slick and very well thought out. Also, they had the experience of the quayside modification program, which had been given to 7th Armoured Brigade, and quite a lot of experience, which enabled them to set up a very satisfactory program for our quayside modifications. All our tanks were modified, and our Warrior fleet was also modified.
The immediate task now confronting the 4th Armoured Brigade is to get into the desert and train. What 7 Brigade had achieved in 3 months, 4 Brigade must achieve in as many weeks.
So it really wasn't until the beginning of January, the 7th of January, that we would be fully deployed into the desert. That would then leave us with another 3 weeks with our vehicles upon which to train. Concurrently with this, it was becoming clear from the 7th Armoured Brigade experience that the reliability of the E&MAs, the engines and major assemblies, was giving cause for concern. And I arrived out, and within 30 hours of arriving, was involved in the equipment management conference at divisional headquarters, where I was being told, much to my chagrin, that I was likely to be very severely limited in the amount of mileage that I could plan on for training, and in both Challenger and Warrior.
The unreliability of our equipment was such that I had to make a series of rather difficult decisions as to what track mileage we could afford to train with. I made these decisions on the following calculation. I established what our mean distance between failure was, and then, and you must understand at this stage, only I knew where we were likely to go and where we were likely to go from. I then divided this figure into our operational range, added a factor for battlefield movement, and then worked out how far I'd go before I was leaving armoured vehicles beside the track simply because I no longer had a power pack to put in them. And that gave me my operational range, with the balance I used for training. This was so little that in order to train 4 Brigade and the artillery units and engineer units as they came in, 7 Brigade was reduced for, my memory is 3 weeks, to 15 kilometres a week.
The problems of restriction of track mileage hadn't hit us at all until another armoured regiment were deployed. And then we then had a shortage of main battle tank packs. Now, we had been training extremely hard for very nearly 3 months at that stage, and I was not concerned about a reduction of training level.
Well, it was an interesting period, this, between the middle of November, really, and Christmas. It was a time when we were operational, but we were pretty certain we wouldn't go to war during that period. And that was because the big peace talks coming up at the end of December in Geneva. I therefore needed to bring the regiment back off the boil, but to keep it simmering along nicely. We went into almost a training cycle, and that cycle involved a break out in the desert in what we call St. Patrick's Camp, where we could relax more, where the boys could have time off. They could go into an enormous tent we pitched out there, which was all blacked out, where they could watch videos in the evening, where they could write their blueys, and where they could relax and play cards.
Meanwhile, the issue of resubordination of the 1st Armoured Division to Arsent is posing problems for General Schwarzkopf and his planning staff, and he at first resists the change.
I don't think there was ever any doubt in his mind about the operational determination and capability of the British forces, none at all. He certainly had concerns about our logistic ability, because had that failed, then it would have either caused the whole of the main assault to falter, or it would have meant we'd have had to call on his already overstretched resources in order to enable our division to continue fighting. And so, quite rightly, he was insistent on being convinced that the British logistic capability was adequate to support the British division in sustained operations over on the western flank.
This presentation was based on a concept of operations which was roughly what actually occurred, and distances, times, and our ability to carry our spares, support, fuel, and ammunition against a very, very fast-moving advance. And the truth of the matter is that in desert, tanks move faster than its logistic support. And how far could we go before we outdistance our logistic support? It was a very, very interesting day, a presentation which was heard in silence by the command group, and at the end of the day, I have no doubt at all that we demonstrated the reality, which is, yes, we could support our division.
Simon had to give, and did give, a brilliant 20-minute, concise, full, and convincing presentation of the British logistic capability. And once he'd done that, the deal was sealed.
With the approach of Christmas, Prince Charles visits British troops in the Gulf.
Highly professional. And I personally have every confidence in the way they perform. They always do.
At home, reservists with medical skills are reporting to their military units up and down the country, the government having evoked Section 10 of the Reserve Forces Act on December the 17th. And Britain's new Prime Minister, Mr. John Major, meets with President Bush in America, signalling no change in the nation's resolve to support the coalition in its determination to achieve the liberation of Kuwait.
We're both still hoping that there will be a peaceful resolution, but I am convinced that Saddam Hussein hasn't gotten the message yet for some odd reason.
In the desert, Christmas Day is celebrated in the knowledge that diplomatic efforts to achieve an Iraqi withdrawal before the January 15th deadline give little cause to hope that war can be averted. With the issue of resubordination resolved in principle, the complexities of how it is to be achieved in practice, and the 1st British Division integrated into the US 7th Corps plan, is now uppermost in the mind of the divisional commander.
The week before Christmas, I was told that I would be going to go under the tactical control for offensive operations of 7 US Corps, whose headquarters was just arriving, and on the 26th of December, I met my Corps commander for the first time.
When I first met with General Smith, Rupert said that he wanted to remain on the East Coast until the whole division had arrived and he could take advantage of the training facilities that had been constructed there in the ranges. And so that was not a problem. And so we looked at the movement to the west. It was a matter of the use of the time.
We had a very good first meeting with the Americans when they briefed us on their operational plan. And at the end of that, both General Rupert and I, on the way back, were really at one in saying that we'd come to an enormously capable organisation with a very good feel operationally for the real problems. And from our point of view, that was an enormous confidence builder. My job then was to make sure that the reverse flow happened, and whenever they saw us, they came away feeling confident.
By the end of 1990, it was clear that we would be hoping to start operations from a military point of view sometime in January. This date was really pretty tight because the start of the war was planned around not only the time available to complete it before Ramadan in the summer, but also the moon phases in order that we would get the most effective contribution from the air forces. And therefore, if we didn't start in January, then we were probably going to slip a month. And by the time we got to February, we were running very short of days to complete the war before the hot weather.
As with land forces, in the air and at sea, the end of 1990 sees the steady build-up of the coalition continuing. Air Vice Marshal Bill Ratton now commands British air forces in the Gulf.
We were to be fully integrated into the United States air campaign plan. There was absolutely no other way in which we could conduct operations if it came to an actual conflict. Our assets in theatre at the time, you'll remember, were the F-3s essentially at Dhahran, We had Tornado GR1s at Tabuk. These squadrons were training, becoming acclimatised, becoming familiar with the theatre. The F3s were established on permanent combat air patrols, defensive posture. We had the tankers in theatre, but not in the right place to realise their full potential. We had the Nimrod MPAs down in the Oman, conducting operations in the Gulf, and we had the Hercules conducting inter-theatre distribution. The force levels were still building up, and just as we were building up our assets, so the United States was as well.
A senior naval officer, Middle East, at the end of 1990, is Commodore Christopher Craig.
Nationally, of course, our ships arrived in theatre worked up. We extended that through single ship workup and then joint exercises. And once again, it was predominantly with the USN in two key areas. One was working up the integration of the mine countermeasures forces, UK and US, to be ready for their northern deployment. The other one of which was establishing the forward barrier of anti-air defence for safeguarding the carriers and all coalition forces. And in that area, it was very much a matter of our destroyers controlling combat air patrols aloft, very much a matter of doing link and communication exercises. And of course, in all of this, they not only worked up, but they were already constituting the forward line of air defence as far north in the Gulf as we were allowed, for very good political reasons, to proceed in late December and early January.
The decision to deploy the 1st Armoured Division with the U.S. Army's 7th Corps in the west necessitates the establishment of a forward force maintenance area to be co-located with the American Log Base Alpha just south of 7th Corps' concentration area, Keys, in the vicinity of Hafir al-Batin. The implications of this, and the requirement for the division to be operationally ready by the end of January, are the dual pressures of greatly extended lines of communication and an extremely short timescale in which to achieve the outload of stocks from the FMA at Al Jubail.
We started to inload Log Base Alpha with 21 days of stocks and to build 2 field hospitals in the vicinity of Hafir al-Batin on the 3rd of January, taking the risk that we would be spotted by the Iraqis. My judgment being that the Iraqis, if they saw us, might think we were either the British helping the Americans inload the American Log Base Alpha, or that this was a British dump being prepared to support an attack up the east coast. The distance between Log Base Alpha and Kuwait City itself being shorter than it was from Devil Dog Dragoon Range.
The establishment of the forward force maintenance area was going to take us 3 weeks, at the minimum I calculated, starting on the 3rd of January and running through till about the 21st. We had something like 18,000 tonnes of ammunition to move, 6,000 tonnes of materiel, and 7 million litres of fuel to get forward. And with the transport assets we had, that's 10 Regiment RCT, 27 Regiment RCT, a great deal of help from the 2 divisional transport regiments, and a number of hired Saudi trucks, we had exactly 3 weeks to carry out this task. The loop was a 700-kilometre round trip, starting in the FMA in Jubail and going up to the forward force maintenance area near the Wadi al-Batin. Trucks were taking something like 36 hours for a round trip. The weather was, at this stage, atrocious. The route was being used by the American Army deployment and all the other coalition forces moving along the Tapline Road, which was a single-track road in fairly bad condition for a lot of the route. And I had my doubts at one stage as whether we were going to make the 21-day outload period.
17 Squadron, one of my squadrons, operating 14-ton trucks, bore the brunt of the whole task, and it's been calculated that the squadron drove to the moon and back during this operation to inload Log Base Alpha.
When we arrived at Log Base Alpha initially, there was absolutely nothing there apart from bare, open, wide-dispersed desert. We created a defensive system using bulldozers, putting berms around all of these logistic installations. My headquarters deployed up there, and we basically created out of bare desert what in BAOR terms would amount to a core supply area.
To accommodate the additional training requirements created by the arrival of the 1st Armoured Division, Headquarters 7 Brigade had, during December, organised the construction of the Devil Dog Dragoon Fire and Manoeuvre Range at Abu Hadriya, in conjunction with the 1st US Marine Corps. Now, in early January, continuing track mileage restrictions and a shortage of training ammunition threatens 7 Brigade's chances of using the facility they had helped create.
And of course, having set about building the Devil Dog Dragoon Range for the 1st Armoured Division, I was damn certain that we were going to be allowed to use it before we moved off 200 miles further to the west. In the event, we were allowed to use the Devil Dog Dragoon Range, and of course, this is the absolute, as far as I was concerned, was the absolute critical moment, because in our first initial period of fire manoeuvre training, we had not manoeuvred at night and fired at night. And of course, what this huge range allowed us to do was two things. One was to manoeuvre as a brigade, and one of those battle groups fire while we were manoeuvring as a brigade. But more importantly, it allowed us to put in a battle group night attack.
We were conducting battle group size live firing at night with no illumination in some respects, with 2 companies of infantry, 2 armoured squadrons, assaulting objectives that they'd never seen before, that the safety staff had barely seen, again with something like 3 safety staff for a company, where the only source of illumination was from the weapons being fired, and that the safety staff, each of them, had 1 siloom on a stick to wave around if the bullets got too close. Devil Dog Dragoon was a very important phase in our preparation, our final preparations, because it increased our confidence, not just in ourselves and our equipment, but also in those people we were working with, the Staffordshire Regiment, Scots Dragoon Guards, and 40 Field Regiment, our close support artillery. Because we did some very adventurous live firing. And throughout that, one could feel the soldiers' confidence and therefore their morale growing daily. By the time we'd finished that, and the various other things we were doing at the same time, which was up-armouring Challenger, we went away knowing we were very good.
For the newly arrived units of the 4th Armoured Brigade, the fire and manoeuvre training on Devil Dog Dragoon Range is to prove every bit as important as it had been for 7 Brigade.
The training itself, to begin with, was very much on the low level. It concentrated on battlefield discipline, it concentrated on people driving clothes down, and it concentrated on getting people adjusted to a war mentality. We trained very hard and imposed very harsh regime on the soldiers from day one.
I told the commanding officers at the time, having read a great deal of really Montgomery's training and his problems when they came back from France in 1940, and the fact that it wasn't until you started to accept casualties that training became realistic and worthwhile. I was determined to, as indeed General Rupert was, to adopt that principle on our training in the desert.
On January the 9th, peace talks are held in Geneva. But with just 6 days to go before the UN deadline for an Iraqi withdrawal runs out, the mood on both sides is somber.
Don't miscalculate the resolve of the American people.
If the American administration decides to attack Iraq militarily, Iraq will defend itself in a very bold manner.
3 days later, January the 12th, UN Secretary-General Perez de Cuellar flies to Baghdad. He is met by Foreign Minister Aziz and talks with Saddam Hussein, but nothing is resolved. January the 15th, With just a few hours to the expiry of the United Nations deadline, a final peace initiative by the French comes to nothing. At 23:30 hours local time, January the 16th, the air war begins. The air campaign is to be pursued in 4 overlapping phases. The suppression of Iraqi air defenses to establish and maintain air superiority. The bombing of strategic targets, including nuclear, biological and chemical installations. Offensive interdiction to paralyze the Iraqi command and control structure. And the preparation of the battlefield by attrition of Iraqi ground forces prior to and in support of the land campaign. It is at 0240 hours local time on January the 17th that the first airstrike is carried out. The destruction of 2 Iraqi early warning radar stations by attack helicopters. Meanwhile, F-117 stealth bombers head for radar sites, communication centers, and other strategic targets deep in Iraq. Already airborne are hundreds of air tankers supporting the main strike force of 1,000+ combat aircraft flying just out of range of Iraqi radar. The attack on a strategic communications target in the center of Baghdad by a stealth bomber using a 2,000-pound laser-guided bomb comes as a stunning and totally unexpected blow to the Iraqi air defense system. Closely following the individual attacks by stealth bombers, which require no air support, there begins a stream of force packages, watched over and guided by E-3 AWACS flying over Saudi Arabia but able to look deep into Iraq, in which combinations of dedicated aircraft, the electronic jammers US Navy EA-6 Prowlers, US Air Force EF-111A Ravens, and the defense suppression planes F-4G Wild Weasels firing HARM high-speed anti-radiation missiles to knock out SAM missile radars, are followed by the bombers and air-to-air fighters, all converging at different speeds and from different bases. RAF Tornado GR-1 attack aircraft, with their JP-233 runway denial weapon systems, play a key role, taking off from their bases at Muharraq in Bahrain and Tabuk in Saudi Arabia between 0130 and 0200 January the 17th for ultra-low-level attacks on Iraqi airfields. From the battleship Wisconsin and other U.S. warships in the Gulf, the first of more than 100 Tomahawk cruise missiles streak into the night sky towards targets which include Saddam Hussein's palace, the Iraqi Ministry of Defense building, and the Iraqi Ba'ath Party headquarters.
Focus on the incoming projectiles. There it goes. They came streaking past, following the same track. The cruise missiles were map-reading themselves along this highway over the gauntlet of gunfire.
We had no way of knowing that our plans and our estimates would be fulfilled. As it turned out, they went just about on schedule. I was amazed. The other thing is we had unknowns. We'd never used the stealth fighter before, really, against a defended target. And here we were sending the entire fleet into Baghdad, the most heavily defended target in the world, the first night. We could have lost the whole lot if the projections had been false or misleading. The other thing is we had no real experience in this total integration of electronic combat with the EF-111s and the Wild Weasels and the EA-6Bs and self-protection and jamming on the airplanes.
We were pretty sure about the precision munitions. We'd used those before, had a lot of testing. But all in all, we just didn't know how it unfolded. We all were very, very apprehensive.
As the aircraft returned to their bases, the success of this massive air assault on day one of Operation Desert Storm is beyond question. The Iraqi Air Force plays little part in resisting the attacks. Effective resistance, where it was encountered at all, takes the form of SAM missiles and anti-aircraft fire. Even as the air war gets underway, 7 Brigade are completing their fire and maneuver training on Devil Dog Dragoon Range. As the leading element of the 1st Armoured Division, 7 Brigade still has to make its move westwards and link up with the US 7th Corps, while 4 Brigade has yet to commence its battle group night attack training on Devil Dog Dragoon. And some units of the artillery group are still arriving in theatre. Thus, as the air war gets underway, the division is, in common with American and other coalition ground forces, still 2 to 3 weeks away from battle readiness.
It was always intended that there would be at least 18 days air war, with the final phase of the air war being the task of reducing the Iraqi ground forces to somewhere around 60% of their capability. And there was no question in Schwarzkopf's mind of the land forces being committed until this level of attrition had been achieved. Therefore, the air war could start quite a lot earlier than the ground war. Furthermore, it was possible for the air war to run on for much longer than had been planned, if that was necessary, and thereby give the ground forces time to get into position.
7th Armoured Brigade continues its move west under the cover not only of the air campaign itself, but of an elaborate deception plan.
The deception plan, of course, was central to everything that we were trying to do, not only from the British point of view, but from the Alliance point of view. And in that respect, our move from the US Marines over to the US Army was a difficult problem, not least of which because the assessment was that wherever the Iraqis saw the British force, they would assume that it was going to be the major point of effort. And trying to keep that point of effort hidden from the Iraqis meant that we had to somehow hide that move across. We had to have a total approach to it. We had to have total secrecy, and that involved, as an example, even keeping the BFBS transmitter over with the Marines well after we'd moved out of the area, because, of course, it became a signature equipment. We also had to avoid telling anybody, wherever possible, what the operational plan was, and so commanders were not briefed in detail on that plan until very, very late in the day.
Well, the deception plan really started before we left the eastern seaboard, where we had been training near the Devil Dog Dragoon range. I had been offered the use of a naval electronic warfare monitoring team, FUSIG, and they came into the Devil Dog Dragoon range area and recorded our transmissions. When we then moved up to Keys, we moved up on radio silence, and they remained in the original area, radiating on the same pattern that we had used while we had been training down there. And they continued to do that until it was necessary for us to start radiating in the area of Keys, which we did in a very controlled fashion, only moving from west to east, in the hope that our destination would still be seen to be the Marines on the eastern seaboard.
In the air, the second night of the offensive is as relentless, destructive, and demoralizing for the Iraqis as the first.
In the very early days, it was critical that we seized control of the air. And that was fundamental to all the success we had in Desert Storm and Desert Shield. And I don't think people truly appreciate that, because the battle was very violent, but very short. It only lasted 2 or 3 days. A key element of that was to put induced shock in his most vital weapon, his MiG-29s, MiG-31s, and F-1s. And the way we did that was a combination of attacks on his airfields to induce confusion and delay, and then putting interceptors directly in the areas where he would launch so that the minute the airplane took off, gear up, and it would blow up. We were very successful at that, and of course, the airfield attack with the Tornadoes and the JP-233 was fundamental to that operation.
Again, the only Iraqi response is anti-aircraft fire, seen here pouring into the night sky over Baghdad. Aircraft losses by the coalition are extremely light, but of the 7 aircraft shot down in the 2,000-plus missions flown during the first 48 hours of the air war, 2 are RAF Tornado GR-1s flying ultra-low-level missions, and GR-1 losses soon rise to 4.
The coalition expected losses, and I think it's most important to bear in mind that historically, with the numbers that we had in theatre, those losses should have run into tens, if not hundreds, of aircraft across the force structure. One of the fundamental demands, of course, of airfield denial weapons is to do exactly that, to deny the enemy the use of his airfields. The enemy showed that he had no intention of using his airfields. And so there was absolutely no logic whatsoever in continuing to fly through his very extensive low-level air defense systems. Some of them radar-laid, most of them visually, some not even that. I mean, the small arms fire was just pointed skywards. But there were curtains of this stuff to fly through. And it was that, we think, which largely caused our losses at low level.
The initial objectives of the air offensive, destruction of the Iraqi command and control system, nuclear, chemical and biological facilities, Scud missile bunkers and other key military and strategic installations, together with the paralysis inflicted upon Iraqi air defenses, leaves few options open to Saddam Hussein by way of response. One, however, does remain: mobile launchers for the Scud missile. On the night of January the 18th, a salvo of Scud missiles is fired from mobile launchers in western Iraq, aimed not at coalition forces, but the civilian populations of Israel and Saudi Arabia.
Scud missiles turned out to be a bigger factor than I thought. We'd war-gamed another war one time, and the fellow fighting the Red Force kept lobbing missiles into our ports and airports, and it caused a lot of problems. And so in April of '90, I discussed with General Schwarzkopf and John Yosak, and I asked for use of the Patriots to provide defenses for our airfields and ports. And I thought that covered it. The Scud has lousy accuracy, a very small warhead, and we had the Patriot. So I was very comfortable with that. What I underestimated was the impact of ballistic missiles and the possibility of chemical warheads on the general populace. Quite frankly, the people in Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain were terrified of the Scuds.
The Patriot missile system proves highly effective against the Scuds, and Patriot batteries hurriedly airlifted into Israel play an important role in the coming weeks, encouraging Israeli restraint in spite of continuing Scud attacks on the civilian population.
The Scud threat certainly sharpened up the morale of the rear end and did us no end of good in the eyes of the forward troops who saw the headquarters being shelled while they sat and sunned themselves. But in actual fact, militarily, it was of no consequence, Scud threat. Politically, it was of great consequence, and it was for that reason that it had to be contained. we used to, in Riyadh, take all sensible precautions, because, of course, one thing we didn't know was whether the Scuds were going to have a chemical capability. And I don't think we really ever felt certain about that until the whole thing was over. And indeed, since the war, it's become clear they could have had a chemical capability. So we always responded on the worst-case basis, and we took normal precautions. You could always tell the difference between the press and the military, because when the Scud attack came in, the press rushed up to the roofs with their cameras, and the military dived down to the basements.
In planning the move of the division and its armoured vehicles up into Keys, I took a risk and continued training. Remember, we were at war, and at the time, the Iraqis were giving every indication that they might attack. And indeed, at the end of January, they did at a place called Kafji. However, because of the shipping delays and the late arrival of ammunition and equipment, I wanted to continue training my artillery group. And as a result, 7th Brigade, the 1st Brigade up route dodge to Keys, went up without artillery support.
As the division started to move into Area Keys, we were deployed out in front to the north of the division with 2 squadrons in a screen. And in fact, from that moment onwards, literally until the time we went into battle, we always had a screen in front of the division. The screen consisted of 2 squadrons, and they were in dug-in OPs, and they were really very, very thoroughly dug in right down into the desert floor. So it would have been almost possible to walk over them in the dark without realising that they were there. But it was a static screen to report on any enemy infiltrations should they occur.
In fact, when it comes, Saddam Hussein's one serious attempt to take the war into Saudi Arabia, apart from his Scud missile attacks on the main centres of population, begins on the evening of January the 29th at Al-Wafra. An Iraqi armoured battalion crosses the border, and in the ensuing battle, 22 Iraqi tanks are destroyed. The following night, January the 30th, the coastal town of Kafji, abandoned by its inhabitants and undefended by coalition forces, is occupied by an Iraqi mechanized unit. With American artillery and air support, Saudi and Qatari forces move up to retake the town in a fiercely fought battle, during which 20 Iraqi soldiers are killed and 400 taken prisoner. The first blue-on-blue engagement of the war occurs at Al-Wafra, when 9 US Marines are killed in their personnel carrier, mistakenly attacked by a coalition aircraft.
Kafji was a battle that was run personally by Saddam Hussein, it now transpires, and it was designed to capture prisoners because they were desperately short of intelligence about what was going on. It was designed to bolster the morale of the Iraqis, and it was designed to test the resolution and substance of the coalition defences. So far as Saddam Hussein is concerned, it was a total disaster, really, on all counts. So far as we were concerned, it gave a tremendous boost to the morale of the Islamic forces. And I suppose, looking back on it, you could say that it was at Kafji that it began to dawn on us that the Iraqi ground forces were not actually going to be up to the reputation that we built up for them in our own minds as a result of their previous experience and hardening in the Iran-Iraq war.
Whilst the battle for Kafji is still underway, 4th Armoured Brigade is completing its battle group fire and manoeuvre exercises on Devil Dog Dragoon Range.
I don't believe that I've ever seen more realistic training. Quite how we didn't kill people in some of the night battles that we simulated during that time, I will never know. I proudly proclaimed on the 30th of January, at the end of exercise Nessun Dorma, the brigade first test exercise, that we were ready for war. In truth, that was frankly far from the truth. I think by then we had prepared a brigade that was capable of performing certain evolutionary drills in the desert. But it wasn't one that could react rapidly to changing situations. It was one that could operate reasonably well on well-charted tasks by day and by night. And I felt that at that stage we had achieved a very sound platform on which to base any subsequent training. And it's quite, in retrospect, it's quite clear to me that the succeeding divisional FTXs, which practiced us in the passage of lines, and we then wrote our own brigade FTXs beyond that, were to be the key to our success in the desert.